Thank you all for joining us tonight. We're just going to let some more people into the room and we'll get going. We really appreciate your attendance here tonight. We have a great all-star panel to talk about this very important topic tonight. And as I said, as soon as we have a few more folks in the room, we'll get it going. We'll kick it off. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please use that only for questions to panelists. We'll be monitoring it and handle as many questions as we can within the time period we have. And we'll also have the chat function open, but that won't be monitored for questions to the panelists. So if it's a question for the panelists, please throw it in the Q&A box. And it's 7:02. We'll wait another minute. And we have somebody joining us from Louisville, Kentucky, isn't that? Well, I'm assuming Kentucky. Where else is there a Louisville? Okay. Well, it's 7:02. There's a good crowd in the room. I think we'll kick this off. My name's Jeff Hoey. I'm the Director of Advocacy for New Jersey Peace Action. Thank you all for coming to the second in a series on Palestine liberation and what we need to do, different aspects of it. Last week, in the first week, Wasim Kanan from American Muslims for Palestine presented a wonderful history, and it was a really great kickoff to the series. Tonight, we'll be talking about U.S. complicity. I want to just thank all the coalition partners that had a lot to do with getting this thing off the ground. We have American Muslims for Palestine, the Palestinian American Community Center in Clifton, the Northern New Jersey chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace, and People's Organization for Progress. As I mentioned, I'll just mention again because a few more people have come in. There's a chat function. The chat function is for chatting. There is a Q&A button also at the bottom of the screen. Attendees will be muted for the duration of the event just because it's hard to handle this number of crowd. But any questions for panelists need to be put in the Q&A box. The chat window, we'll try to monitor it, but it won't be monitored for questions. And with that said, I want to introduce my colleague at New Jersey Peace Action, Adam Hockenberry, who is our Director of Outreach. Adam, over to you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to everybody for joining us, and thank you to our wonderful panelists. We're really excited to have you all here and dive into this really important aspect of the conflict, excuse me, not even the conflict, but the enablement that the U.S. allows for. So we're going to get into it tonight. We're going to hear from all of our experts. And just to give a bit of background, we're going to start with Raed Jarrar, who's an Arab-American political advocate based in Washington, D.C. Since he immigrated to the U.S. in 2005, he's worked as a lobbyist on political issues pertaining to the U.S. engagement in the Arab world. He is widely recognized as an expert on political, social, and economic developments in the MENA region. He has testified in numerous congressional hearings and briefings. He is a frequent guest on national and international media outlets in Arabic and English, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and Sky News Arabia. He has been published in the New York Times and quoted in media outlets including the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, The Hill, The Guardian, Newsweek, and more. Raed was raised in countries all across the Middle East. He's a graduate of the University of Baghdad, where he received his bachelor's degree, and the University of Jordan, where he received his master's, both in architectural engineering. His master's thesis focused on post-war reconstruction, and he is on the advisory board of the organization Air Wars. We're also joined by Phyllis Bennis, who is the director of the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, focusing on the Middle East, US wars, and UN issues. She's also a fellow of Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. In 2001, she helped found the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights and now serves on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace. She works with many anti-war and Palestinian rights organizations, writing and speaking widely across the US and around the world. She has served as an informal advisor to several top UN officials on Middle East issues and was twice shortlisted to become UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. Phyllis has written and edited 11 books. Among her latest is the just published 7th updated edition of her popular Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. She has also written Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terror, and Challenging Empire, How People, Governments, and the UN Defy U.S. Power. Last but not least, we are joined by James Zogby, the co-founder of the Arab American Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based organization which serves as the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community in 1985 and continues to serve as its president. He is director of Zogby Research Services, a firm that has conducted groundbreaking surveys all across the Middle East. In September of 2013, President Obama appointed Dr. Zogby to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He was reappointed to a second term in 2015 and concluded his service in May 2017. He was twice elected the vice chair. Zogby is featured frequently on national and international media as expert on Middle East affairs. Since 1992, he has written a weekly column that is published in 12 countries. In 2010, Zogby published the highly acclaimed book Arab Voices. In 2013, his ebooks, Looking at Iran, The Rise and Fall of Iran in Arab Public Opinion, and 20 years after Oslo, are drawn from his extensive polling across the Middle East with Zogby Research Services. His most recent book, The Tumultuous Decade, Arab, Turkish, and Iranian Public Opinion, 2019, analyzes the fascinating transformations taking place across from the Middle East region following U.S. withdrawal from Iraq in the Arab Spring. Dr. Zogby has also personally been active in U.S. politics for many years. In 1984 and 1988, he served as deputy campaign manager and senior advisor to Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign. In 1988, he led the first ever debate on Palestinian statehood at that year's Democratic National Convention in Atlanta, Georgia. In 2000, 2008, and 2016, he served as an advisor to the Gore, Obama, and Sanders presidential campaigns. For the last 3 decades, he has served in leadership roles with the Democratic National Committee. He currently serves as the chair of the DNC Ethnic Council, an umbrella organization of Democratic Party leaders of European and Mediterranean descent. He served on the DNC's executive committee from 2000 to 2017, and for more than a decade served as co-chair of the party's resolutions committee. In 1975, Dr. Zogby received his doctorate from Temple University, Department of Religion, where he studied under Islamic scholar Dr. Ismail al-Faruqi. He was a National Endowment for the Humanities postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University in 1976 and is the recipient of a number of honorary doctorate degrees. So it's safe to say we have a lot of expertise and we're very thankful to have you all here joining us tonight. And we're looking very much forward to hearing from all of you. So we're going to kick it off if everybody's ready. And we're going to pass it right over to, oh my gosh, after reading all of that, I'm forgetting who's going first. Who's going first, you guys?
I think we agreed that I will go first.
That's right. That's right. All right. So over to you, and thank you all for listening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Jeff. It's such an honor to be on the same panel with 2 of my mentors and heroes, Phyllis and Jim. I love you both, and I have so much respect for you. My name is Ra'ed Jarrar, and as Adam mentioned, I am the advocacy director at Dawn. Dawn is the organization that was founded by Jamal Khashoggi before his murder in 2018. So we were not officially launched until 2020. It's a still new operation, but we're expanding. Most of our work so far has been on Saudi Arabia, as you would imagine, but other abusive governments in the Middle East. And unfortunately, we have lots of those. So we've been working on Egypt, on Emirates, Bahrain, some other governments. And as of this month, we're officially launching our Israel-Palestine work. We're going to be hiring 2 or 3 additional staff members to only work on Israel-Palestine. I think that the title of this panel and what I will say now will describe generally where Dawn stands on this issue, because I think that the word complicity doesn't actually capture how bad the situation is when it comes to the US involvement in Israel-Palestine. The United States has historically been very, very involved in supporting Israel militarily and politically. As of now, the United States gives Israel $3.8 billion a year of tax dollar money. And that money is exceptional in so many different ways. Flow of unrestricted money with no checks and balances to Israel. It's unbelievable, unprecedented, unparalleled when compared to any other relationship that the United States has. It's a lot of money. $3.8 billion is more than 20% of the entirety of the military budget in Israel. Israel is a rich country with a very high GDP. Many people argue it has a much better, the economy of Israel is much better than the economy of the United States when it comes to the national debt and the state's capability to provide for its citizens. But the US continues to provide $3.8 billion a year with free money. This money, I was saying, it's unparalleled because I would say a few words about this. So on the one hand, this is the highest figure around the world with foreign military financing. It's somewhere around 55% of the entirety of all of the foreign military financing that the United States provides to the world. So the entire world, Israel gets more than half of the entirety of FMF funds, foreign military financing, that is sent to the entire world. Like imagine the sheer volume of this money. But out of this money, Israel is the only country in the world that receives the entirety of its money within the first 30 days of the fiscal year. This is mandated in US law. It's the only country in the world that receives all of the $3.8 billion in the first 30 fiscal days of the year, which means by October 30th, they've received the $3.8 billion. Because this makes it impossible to track where the money is going. It's a devastating blow to existing requirements in US law to have end-use monitoring. And this is an important word that I will say multiple times today, end-use monitoring. We have no end-use monitoring when it comes to Israel because we give them everything in one big chunk because of this ridiculous requirement in law. And they can do whatever they want to do with it because we have no idea where it goes. So that's one problem for the broken system. The other problem is that we give Israel a big chunk of this $3.8 billion in cash. It's the only country in the world that receives a portion of this foreign military financing in cash that they can buy their own weapons or whatever they wish with the money. So this is called the Overshores Procurement Program, OSP, Overshores Procurement. OSP is only for Israel. Historically, it was at 26.3% of the money that Israel receives. Now it is technically supposed to be tapered off to zero by 2028. So now we're at around 20% of that. So imagine 1/5 of the money that we give to Israel is money that they buy their own weapons. Like there is absolutely no accountability or tracking mechanism to know where that money is going. It's really mind-boggling when you think about it. Israel maintains an office of OSP office in New York. They decide to buy their own weapons. They do some procurement, sometimes of other kind of weapons together. Now, these like structural problems end up manifesting themselves also politically because the United States has failed to implement our own laws when it comes to Israel. I'll mention a couple of them before I pass the mic to Phyllis. One of the important laws when it comes to foreign military financing is Foreign Assistance Act, or the FAA. The Foreign Assistance Act has an important section of it. It's referred to as the Leahy Amendments. These parts prohibit the United States from funding foreign security units that have committed gross violations of human rights. Now, Israeli troops commit gross violations of human rights every day. And our organizations have documented and sent hundreds of examples of gross violations of human rights to the State Department. It include extrajudicial killings by Israel, enforced disappearances by Israel, even some cases of torture by Israel, and other examples of other details here and there. Not a single unit has been suspended in the history of the United States with Israel. Not one unit. Every year, there are somewhere around 1,000 units that get suspended around the world because of violations. Not one Israeli unit in the history of the country. I mean, can you just believe this? Like, we're not talking about, massive mechanisms for cutting aid to Israel or rethinking our failed policies in Israel or using leverage to, end annexation or defund settlements. We're talking about like a simple, silly law that would say cut aid from one unit that is behind an extrajudicial killing. We have never done that. So when it comes to bigger issues, of course, it's almost impossible to even bring up. So I want to say this: like our work with Dawn, my work with other organizations, we have been focusing on this particular angle, which is how can we stop the flow of US dollars that are contributing to human rights violations in Israel Palestine. Whether these dollars are going to the security assistance to the Palestinian Authority, like what we saw in the case of Nizar Banat earlier this month when he was killed by the PA, whether the dollars go to the Israeli security forces where they commit gross human rights violations every day, they commit crimes against humanity like apartheid with their larger policies. Our main goal as an organization is to push the United States government to stop subsidizing and contributing to violations by Israel, by the PA, by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia, by others. And I think that comes from a theory of change that the United States is a part of the problem. We have a problem, definitely, and it has many parts, and the United States is a part of the problem. And from our perspective as US Americans, the number one priority can be stopping our own government from using our own money to subsidize and pay for these violations. So let me stop here. I know I have a lot to say. I know everyone else has a lot to say about this issue, but let me stop myself here and give the floor to Phyllis to give her remarks. And thanks again for inviting me to speak on the panel today, Adam and Jeff.
Thanks, Raed. That was great. And a big thank you to Peace Action of New Jersey for bringing us all together. Thank you all for showing up tonight to have this discussion. It's such an important set of questions that we need to be addressing. What I'm going to talk about, that was a very good background on sort of how US enabling of the Israeli crimes goes forward. I'm going to talk about how that's perceived in the United States, about the discourse on these questions, and particularly how it's shifted. So there's been an amazing level of a shift over the last, say, 20 years, 25 years. I'm not going to go through all of it. It's an amazing history. And for those of us who have been around this movement for a long time, these last years have been quite extraordinary in the pace of change as well as the quality of change, where now we have, from the 2018 election and again in 2020, we actually elected people to Congress who have a real commitment to Palestinian rights in various forms. That's really a new phenomenon that we haven't seen before. But more broadly, what we're seeing is a real challenge to what was once pretty uncritical acceptance and support among people across this country for the US policy. The US policy goes back particularly since 1967. It goes back, of course, even before 1948 when Israel was founded, but the so-called special relationship emerged in 67. I'm, again, not going to go through that history, but just to know that there was a number of decades where the challenge to that US uncritical embrace of Israel really didn't exist in a way that had much impact. There were movements Jim and I both have been involved in those movements for way more years than we'd like to remember. But in terms of actually influencing policy, it wasn't going very far. So why do we see a change now? Part of it has to do with the Israeli actions. Israeli actions are worse. They've gotten worse and worse, more repressive, more examples of the denial of Palestinian rights across the board. And those violations of international law, violations of human rights, are also more visible, partly because of social media, partly because the longstanding Israeli efforts to prohibit the presence of international journalists from parts of its own territory, parts of occupied Palestinian territory, is simply not possible anymore. And you have things that are flying in the face of how people in this country like to think of our own country and of Israel, which is touted as the only democracy in the Middle East. It's touted as our best friend in the Middle East, et cetera. So when things happen like the passage of the so-called nation state law, which was in 2018, that essentially writes into the equivalent of a constitution in Israel, would be the equivalent of a constitutional amendment that says explicitly that only Jews have the right of self-determination in the state of Israel, when 20% of the citizens of the state of Israel are not Jews, are Palestinians. And it says explicitly they do not have those rights. So it was making de jure, making legal, what was a longstanding practice of denial of these rights. So you have these shifts for a whole bunch of reasons. You saw an earlier shift at the time of the first Intifada, again at the time of the second Intifada or uprising, at the time of the Oslo agreements, when the first major attack on Gaza, the so-called caste-led war of 2008 and 9 took place. Each of these moments, you saw a shift in this discourse. But what didn't change was the policy. So the financial aid remained the same. Under Obama, the memorandum of understanding that Raed spoke of, that guarantees a minimum of $3.8 billion a year of our tax money, that hasn't changed. That was a 10-year agreement, right? With $3.8 billion a year, $38 billion. Protection at the United Nations, protection from any accountability in the International Criminal Court, a long-standing promise of the US to Israel, and something that didn't used to be challenged. Now we're hearing new discussion about that. We've seen shifts in the language from different presidents and members of Congress, but never a shift in the action, never a shift in the policy. When Trump came in, the policy did shift. It became much more extreme. It became an explicit embrace of the most extremist elements of the Israeli body politic, if you will, led by the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So that included the embrace of the nation state law. It included the decision by Trump to move the US embassy to Jerusalem in complete violation of UN resolutions and international law, recognizing the occupied Golan Heights as somehow legally annexed by Israel, recognizing somehow that settlements are legal in complete violation of international law, claiming that annexation of Palestinian territory is okay. Israel can go ahead and do that. This took the rhetoric much further. When Joe Biden came into office, he had the option to simply go back to what would have been the normal level of illegal support for Israel. But instead, he chose to leave in place all of those Trump policies. So in doing so, he made them his own. I don't happen to think that Joe Biden actually supports some of those policies. I don't think he agreed with moving the embassy to Jerusalem. But as long as he leaves it there, as long as he doesn't change it, that's his policy. And he's now accountable for it. So, you can't sort of have it both ways when we change administrations. The president has the right to make those changes. But if they don't, they become accountable for what their predecessor may have done. So that's a serious problem. Biden talks a different talk than Trump did, certainly, but he's paying off the same $3.8 billion. There's no action on settlements. He still isn't allowing the United Nations to condemn the settlements. In fact, he refused until days after it was necessary to even call for an immediate ceasefire during Israel's last set of attacks on Gaza in May of this year. And I want to say one other thing before I come to the immediate period, and then I'll turn it over to Jim. And that has to do with the role of movements in transforming the discourse across the United States. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen movements for Palestinian rights that have been around for a very long time. And they made gains in certain areas, in certain cities, even on a national level at changing some small things. But it's really only recently that we see the issue of Palestinian rights being taken up far more broadly than the movements that define themselves as an organization for Palestinian rights, a movement for Palestinian rights. So we see in the Black Lives Matter movement, when it first erupted in Ferguson in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown, you all will remember that right from the beginning, there was this link with Palestine. Why? Because Palestinians were seeing on their social media coverage of these horrific police riots that were going on in Ferguson. And they realized that, among other things, the tear gas that was being used in Ferguson was the same tear gas that's used against them in occupied Palestine, because it's made by the same companies. American labs federal labs in, what state is it in? Somebody help me here. It's in Pennsylvania and others. And they knew how to cope because they've been doing it for a long time. So they used social media and immediately got in touch with protesters in Ferguson, teaching them how to use onions and lemons and milk in various ways to combat that same tear gas, right? So that level of human solidarity took place immediately. And then as the Black Lives Matter movement began to take root and emerge on a much broader level, far beyond Ferguson, it was one of many movements that started seeing Palestine and Palestinians through the lens of racial justice and seeing Israeli treatment of Palestinians as something that is linked to racism as it's practiced here in the United States. So through that, we saw the mainstreaming of the issue of Palestine, the mainstreaming of Palestinian rights emerge within progressive circles, being influenced far more broadly than it had been before. Indigenous rights movements, immigrant rights movements, the climate movement. We've seen it most recently in the human rights movements, which traditionally have been very cautious they've criticized Israeli practices, yes, but they've been very cautious in doing so. All of a sudden, the discourse has shifted, so it's safe now. So we see Human Rights Watch, one of the most influential and historically one of the most cautious in its criticisms of Israel, explicitly holding Israel accountable for violations of the crime of apartheid. B'Tselem, the most influential of the Israeli human rights organizations, calling it apartheid from the river to the sea in the interest of maintaining Jewish supremacy. It's incredible language that they never would have used before. So all of this is emerging in this context. So then when we come to the current crisis that erupted in April of this year around the conflict in Jerusalem, around the seizure of homes, the demolition of homes in neighborhoods of occupied East Jerusalem, again in direct violation of the Geneva Conventions and international law, and then in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah, where the question of eviction was on the agenda and Palestinian families were faced with numerous incidents of being evicted so that Israeli settlers, Jewish Israeli settlers, could move in and take over their homes. And then culminating in the attack on the Al-Aqsa Mosque and eventually the assault on Gaza that lasted for 11 days. This wasn't different than the attack in 2014, the attack in 2012, the attack in 2008 and 9, but it was different because people saw it more and they saw it differently and they saw it in the context of this discourse already having been changed. And we saw in Congress an enormous shift. We have now champions in Congress who came out explicitly and said, we stand with Palestinians and we demand that Israel stop, that we stop sending money in some cases, that they not be allowed to use US weapons or US funds for these illegal actions. They immediately challenged the additional $735 million that Israel suddenly wanted to buy new weapons to replace those they had used up in Gaza. So in all of these situations, you saw the champions of Palestinian rights. But what was as important, perhaps more important than what our champions were doing, was that we saw motion, we saw bits and pieces of movements, small movements, by many in Congress who were not our champions, who had never supported Palestinian rights, but who were moved and who felt like they finally could say what they were seeing and what they believed, even in a way that wasn't very strong, it wasn't very helpful, but they were saying it in a different way because it was the first time. So we had 12 Jewish members of Congress who voted, who signed a letter demanding an immediate ceasefire when their president, Joe Biden, was refusing to call for a ceasefire. We saw 29 senators doing the same thing. We saw 500 former campaign staff members of the Biden campaign who had gotten him elected, who came out and wrote an extraordinary letter where they talked about the need to work to end the underlying conditions of occupation, blockade, and settlement expansion that led to this exceptionally destructive period in a 73-year history of dispossession and ethnic cleansing. 500 former Biden workers talking about ethnic cleansing. This was extraordinary. There was a new columnist at the Washington Post, and in his first or second column, he's a brand new guy, right? He writes about the need for Biden to support Palestinian rights. And the sky didn't fall because it's been mainstreamed. It's been mainstreamed. There are new possibilities now. Organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace can barely keep up with the numbers of new members that are coming in, not because JVP, and I'm proud to serve on the board of JVP, we did nothing to recruit off of the crisis in Gaza because it's just not appropriate to do so. And yet we were flooded with new members who found us online and said, I want to be part of that. And I want to end with something about that in terms of how this discussion goes forward. In the Jewish Telegraphic Agency yesterday, there was a new report of a new poll that was just taken. It was done about 2 weeks ago. And it was quite extraordinary. It was a poll of American Jews. And among other things, 25% of American Jews agrees with the statement, Israel is an apartheid state. 22% agree with the statement that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians. 34% say that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the United States. And if you look at younger Jews, it's even more powerful. 20% say Israel does not have the right to exist as a state. A third, 33%, say that Israel is committing genocide. More than a third say that Israel is an apartheid state. It's an extraordinary moment. And I want to end with something important for how we talk about this in our work. In a piece recently in the Washington Post, it was about 10 days or so after the ceasefire in Gaza. And the article was basically about how the new challengers in the Democratic Party, both activists on the street and activists within the Democratic Party, are now criticizing longstanding Democratic Party support for Israel. But it says that there is now a set of splits that are underway. And it says that this coalition is now fracturing over how to move forward, with sharp disagreements over demands and tone that could threaten their ability to keep shaping the debate. And here's the key thing. It says, some favor restricting aid to Israel or blocking arms sales, while others favor more controversial steps, such as boycotts and sanctions. I thought that was extraordinary because what it says is that sanctions as we understand them, which means restricting aid and blocking arms sales, is not controversial. The only thing controversial about it is using the word sanctions. And there's no rule that says we have to use the word sanctions. The action is what's important. And this is a moment when we can reach far more broadly than our movement has ever reached before. You know, the ties that have been built between the Palestinian rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for Black Lives, between parts of the indigenous rights movements, all of these movements are crucial, hugely important ties. This is also a moment when we can be building those same kind of ties with a much wider range, where it's not only the movement for Black Lives, but also the NAACP, where it's not only the Women's March, which is so important, but also the National Organization for Women. The mainstream organizations on these issues are open in ways they have never been before. So we have a huge amount of work to do to take on that work while consolidating our work within the broader progressive movements that include Peace Action and so many others that have done such extraordinary work for so long. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Phyllis, and thank you, Rod, and thanks to the hosts for inviting me. I will start where Phyllis left off and build on what both she and Rod said by saying the following. In recent discussions that I've had with, or debates, you may call them that, with supporters of Israel, I find it fascinating that the conversation has dramatically shifted. There is no disagreement, as the polls show, that Israel policies are deplorable, or that Palestinians are victims of widespread abuse, or that the situation has become untenable in terms of the old mantra of we want negotiations to a two-state solution. There's this general sense that something smells bad and that is so broken that it may not be able to be fixed. And yet where folks get stuck is what to do about it. Ever since I came to Washington with the Palestinian Human Rights Campaign back in 1978, I founded the PHRC in 76, moved here to run it in 78. I found that there's what I call in Congress the "I'm really with you guys" butt club. These were the members of Congress who would say to me, I get it, I really get it, but I can't do anything because it's I got to run for re-election, and they would be nervous as get out about it. Look, I knew Tom Harkin when senator from Iowa was member of Congress, when he was instrumental in writing the Foreign Assistance Act. We have an annual human rights report that is written by the State Department, not for no reason. It was originally written in order to provide Congress with the evidence as to whether or not countries were violating human rights. It was written, in other words, in order to provide the background so that Congress could fulfill its responsibility according to the law and say, these are human rights violators, they shouldn't get aid. Even from the very first reports, it was very clear that Israel was a violator. The State Department didn't need the Palestinian Human Rights Campaign to tell them Israel's violating the law. They knew it. They had all the evidence that they were collecting on the ground. It was the conclusion that was concerning, because it would go to Congress and Congress would give Israel a pass. We were back then quite complicit, as Rod said. I've said in the past that we were the coat holders and the cheerleaders for what Israel was doing. Most recently, we've become the gun reloaders by resupplying them with the ammunition and smart bombs they are using. The not so smart bombs, one might say. But it is not because we didn't know. We did know, but there was fear. And the fear was that you'd lose an election. The fear was that your office would be so inundated with protests that you would literally not be able to function. The fear was that you would lose even supporters in your own district. I went to see a member of Congress at one point who I thought might be supportive. And when I told him what I wanted, I had two mayors that had been expelled from the West Bank and I needed his support. He said, I've got people in my district who they even knew I was talking with you, would not want me to be doing that. They've been with me since I was in city council. They've been my friends lifelong. And so I'm going to take a pass on it. That sense of knowing what was wrong, but being unable to do anything about it has been what stymied action. Now, Phyllis, I think correctly points out that there's a shift afoot. More significant, I think, than many of the other things that have happened recently is the letter that J Street organized that had 73 members of Congress on it, calling for the Biden administration to do 12 things, one of which was to revert back to the Carter administration language of settlements being illegal under international law, which is of enormous consequence. There is a move afoot. What happened to bring that about? The first thing that happened is a tremendous shift in public opinion, especially among Democrats. It was not created by Bernie, but Bernie helped push it forward. Bernie recognized after a few times in the field when he would speak about the Palestinians and the response that he'd get, that this was an issue that had an audience. It was right. He wanted to do it. But when you get reinforced by your supporters, then you're encouraged to continue with it. We went to the platform debates in 2016. I was on the drafting committee. We presented our planks. We lost everything, but we had what amounted to the second only debate on Israel-Palestine in a Democratic Party platform. By the time you get to 2000, public opinion, especially among Democrats, had shifted even further. You couldn't get the word settlements in the platform in 2016. It was in 2020. Language in the platform that we had asked for about the equal rights of Israelis and Palestinians was also in the platform. There was language about annexation in the platform. Now, why were they there? Because the drafters knew that this is where the Democratic base is. When you look at the polls, there's a partisan split that's also a demographic split, with young people in particular on one side of the equation, older white born again on the other side. It's young African American, Latino, Asian, Jewish Americans in growing numbers, reflecting an attitude that says what Israel is doing is awful, Palestinians are victims, and we want to support the victims. And so the platform drafting committee came up with language that actually spoke to all these things. The one fight we had was over the issue of conditioning aid. And I said to them, if you say no settlements, if you say no annexation, if you say equal worth and equal rights for both peoples, but Israel keeps doing things that make it clear that settlements are going to continue, creeping annexation will continue, and Palestinians will be abused in horrific ways, and you keep funding it, and there's no condition placed on that aid, then what you're doing is you're becoming complicit in it. Again, you get the response, that's a bridge too far. It was an issue that they weren't willing to take up because they feared electoral or political consequences. Now, look at what's happened. In 2020, Jamal Bowman beat Elliot Engel. Marie Newman beat Dan Lipinski. Cori Bush beat William Lacey. Rashida won re-election. Ilhan won re-election. There wasn't a single person who signed on to Betty McConnell's bill calling for conditioning aid because of Israel's treatment of children, who lost their contests. The I'm really with you guys butt club gets the message that there may not be consequences at this point. Coming up in just a couple of weeks in Ohio 11 is what I think is maybe the most consequential election of my generation. And that covers actually a couple of different generations. Nina Turner is running against Shontel Brown. Nina is right now up in the polls. Nina has called for conditioning aid to Israel. And Nina is being viciously attacked by the Democratic Majority for Israel, the same group that spent millions defaming Bernie, Jamal Bowman, etc., trying to defeat progressive candidates. And they're pouring in the same kind of money to make sure that Nina doesn't win. If you look at that election, Why are they spending so much? Number one, because they understand after all the defeats they suffered in 2020, there's a hemorrhaging. They've got to stem the hemorrhaging, and they've got to show that they can win. If they lose this, I believe that it will be as decisive as when Pete McCluskey beat Shirley Temple Black in the 60s. And yes, that Shirley Temple. Pete was a member of, he was a Marine Corps colonel who was a Republican who ran against the war in Vietnam, and he won. And members of Congress said, oh, you mean I can run on this and win an election? It's not something that I have to be afraid of. And they caught up with the general drift that had been taking place with the anti-war movement. Americans were against the war, but Congress was afraid to be against the war because of the forces that would be arrayed against them. When Pete won, all of a sudden it sent a different message. When Nina wins, the same thing will happen. And the dam, I think, will break. I've always felt that in order to shift the debate in a significant and decisive way, we had to beat somebody, or we had to win an election that would send the message that they are not all powerful, and that in fact justice can reign supreme in a debate. And I think that's kind of where we are right now. So I believe that the problem begins in electoral politics, and the problem is solved by electoral politics. We've got to win elections, because at the end of the day, the people who are making the decisions about all the things that Rod said, I mean, it's bizarre. If you look at the aid, you know, it's 3.8 billion. But if you look at every single budget, from the Agriculture Department budget to the Commerce Department budget, the education, there are little little cutouts for Israel. When I was running a project for Vice President Gore in the 90s called Builders for Peace, promoting economic development to support the peace process back then, we wanted to do something that the farmers in Gaza needed some help with, how to improve agriculture in the very arid area that Gaza was. And so we were told by the Department of Agriculture that there's a consortium of universities in the Southwest that gets a $10 million budget exactly to promote that kind of technology. So I should go to the next meeting, and I did go to the meeting, and seated at the head of the table was the representative from a university in Israel who actually got the $10 million to administer it for the American universities to do agriculture in arid areas. There are so many of those cutouts all over the place. And the reason why is because they feel it's not only a safe bet, but it's a smart bet to get support for re-election. And frankly, it's a myth. That's not why they win elections. That's not why AIPAC doesn't have that kind of power. But the myth of that power has been driving people away from justice based on fear that they would lose if they didn't do what Israel wants. I think that myth is being shattered, and the sooner we shatter it, the better for the U.S. to get on the right side of history and the right side of justice. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zogby. I mean, that's really wonderful. And as far as knowing that we're heading in a direction now where the dam will break. Everybody, you know, Peace Action, we're really proud to have endorsed Nina Turner. And I would recommend everybody to contribute if you can, because like he said, there's millions of dollars being put in to try and stop that from happening. So if you're able to, please contribute to that campaign, and please contribute to the work of Peace Action as well. You know, we're always supporting candidates who are going to fall in line with trying to fight for justice. So we're going to pass over to some Q&A. We have a few questions lined up here, and I just want to make a statement, make an announcement. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please drop it in the Q&A section. We'll do our best to get to them. So we're going to start with a question from Mira Jaffrey, who asks, can you discuss the media's complicity in this situation? And can you discuss why the media is only beginning to appear neutral? Are young people fed up of the media always protecting Israel's abusive policies, so they have stopped reading, for example, the New York Times? So whoever would like to take that question. I think Phyllis is grinning. So I'm going to maybe nominate you there, Phyllis.
Well, I'll start. I think Jim and Ryan will probably have some things to add as well. You know, I think that the role of the media is a very important one, and it's very complicated. Social media has made the role of traditional media far more complicated to analyze, to think about how influential is it or isn't it. You know, when there were only 3 networks and there was a half-hour news on each one, and they were all pretty much the same, that was a different world than the world today of cable news and the choices, the narrowing of what we hear and what we learn. I think that certain media, and I would say the New York Times and the Washington Post and the PBS NewsHour and, you know, NPR, a few others that are central to the mainstream media are still very, very influential. They're influential particularly on people in power. You know, a lot of people read them not because they're all that interested in what the New York Times has to say by itself, but because you want to know what people in power are reading if you want to influence those people. So it's important to read the New York Times for that reason. But it's also, the New York Times is one of the few newspapers that actually has bureaus around the world. So how they cover something is often problematic, but they are able to cover it in a way that small independent, you know, our media, independent media, often isn't. They don't have the financial resources or the other kinds of resources. So it's a complicated thing. I think we have to be careful not to just fall into the mainstream media is all just in Israel's pocket and we shouldn't bother reading it and we should, you know, only listen to our own media, you know, and our media is incredibly important. People should be watching Democracy Now! But it's a mistake, I think, to think that we can create our own media and ignore the influence of mainstream media, both on people in power and on the broader discourse. The shift in media discourse has been profound over these last several years. I think for people who come lately into the Palestinian rights movement, you look at the media and say, oh, this sucks, frankly, pardon my language. This is really awful. And on any objective standards, that's absolutely right. It is awful. It's one-sided. It doesn't feel any compulsion to treat issues fairly. If you compare it to what it was 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, it's an entirely different world. You see the word Nakba, the Arabic word for catastrophe, which is how Palestinians refer to the war of 1947-48, when 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes and lost their homes, never to be able to return. You see the word Nakba on the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post all the time. You see Palestinian voices in the papers, on the radio, in the television, all the time. An organization like IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, whose sole job is to get Palestinian voices and pro-Palestinian analysis into the mainstream media. When they started out, it was like one person struggling to get anybody to pay attention to her. Now they've got a staff of, I don't know, 16, 18, 20 people scattered across the country, and they can't keep up. They can't keep up with the demand. So the shift in the media has been extraordinary. Now, can we be complacent about it and say, it's all good, we're all done here? No, of course not. It still is pretty awful. But it's so much different. It's so much better than it used to be, that the combination of the mainstream media with the independent media that has grown and matured so much in the last 20 years is an incredible combination that is really empowering. And I would just end with the understanding also that the role of social media has made it much more difficult. It's not so much that young people are tired of the New York Times not watching, not covering Israel fairly, and so they stop listening to it. It's because they can read New York Times reporters on Twitter. So they may not be reading the paper, but they're following those reporters because they know a lot. They know a lot. The reasons that they didn't always write about it, some of them didn't know very much when they started out. Some of them grew up as hardcore supporters of Israel, hardcore Zionists, because they grew up in this country and went to the same schools and read the same pro-Israel books that the rest of us did and never broke with that. So there's a bunch of reasons for it. Sometimes their editors or their publishers said, no, you're not publishing that because we don't want to risk being attacked. That happens, of course, it still does. But it's also true that for every Mark Lamont Hill who gets fired by CNN for a speech he gives at the United Nations, where he says everyone should be free from the river to the sea, and that's considered unacceptable. You have now people saying that all the time, and that was only 2 years ago. 3 years ago, I forgot about the year of the pandemic, sorry. I mean, that wasn't very long ago, right? That Mark went through that. Now, that doesn't happen. Other things happen for sure, and we have to fight each one of them. But it's just a different world out there.
Let me make a couple observations. One is that the culture has changed. My brother wrote a book back in 2008 in which he took various demographic groups and he called the youngest demographic group First Globals. There is a consciousness that young people have, largely due to internet and largely due to life experience, that has created a sense of awareness about the world in a way that older generations didn't have. I remember when Obama was running against McCain, we looked at it as two different parties and two different ideologies. It wasn't, and two different races or two different generations. It wasn't just that. It was two entirely different images of what it meant to be an American. It was the guy who put on a uniform and went and fought in a war, and the guy who, you know, basically to sort of reduce it to the absurd, would say drive a Prius and pick up litter. I mean, it was like, it was an awareness of environment, an awareness of consciousness of the world, an awareness of the shared humanity we have with others. Young people grow up with that. And so I find when I talk with new reporters now, it used to be the reporters would come to me with a sort of a fixed mindset. I'm going to cover the Middle East. And they already knew what they were going to cover. They were looking for the story to validate what they already knew. Young folks who are now entering journalism have a broader sense of the world. And they actually are reflecting that in what they write. And on social media, we see it all the time. I mean, social media is a window to the world in many ways. I think Phyllis is right. You can't limit yourself to just that. You really need to see the New York Times. But when you look at the New York Times, understand that this is the paper that published the faces of every person who died in the Gaza war. That never happened before. When Baruch Goldstein killed 29 people in a mosque, not only weren't there pictures there, nobody even talked about their names. The story in the Washington Post was, how did the good doctor go bad? This is now, the victims have a face and a voice. And that is because there's a broader cultural change afoot. And I think in that context, not only is the debate changing, but we're winning. So I had to deal with this all the time about the media. The media is changing, just like politics are changing, and they're changing both because the culture is changing, and the culture doesn't change just one way; it changes both ways. I mean, to the extent to which there's a first global generation, there's also a Trump generation. There's blowback. I mean, we're in a huge fight to define not just America and our future, but to define politics as we move forward. So we can't take it for granted that change is afoot, but there is a real shift that's taken place, and I think we have to recognize that.
So Dr. Zogby, I hear you say that, and it reminds me of your great interview with Katie Halper. You've lived this. You're a part of this shift in media and new media, and I think it's wonderful. And this kind of ties into a question from Litza Binder. And I actually, before I go there, we're just crossing into the 8 o'clock threshold. I just want to see if everybody's okay to stay on for just a few more minutes to answer one or two more questions. Is that okay? Can I get a nod or?
Yeah.
Thank you. So let's ask, what do you suggest for our organizations and organizations in general, and we as individuals do to increase support for Palestinian rights? So at the personal level and at the organizational level, engaging with this work, what are some steps forward that you all see as productive?
Just let me start with one thing. I go back to what I did with the Palestine Human Rights Campaign that I still think is what is required today for decades, the Arab-Israeli conflict in the American mind was Israeli people versus the Palestine problem. It was humanity on one side and a problem to be solved on the other side. Even with some liberals today, it's still there. It's the demographic problem so Israel can be a Jewish state. I mean, it's not real people. It's personalized the story. And I think that's where Palestinian officialdom has done a crap job. They have not helped us identify real people to tell their stories. Those stories of what's happening, the New York Times did in one day that I thought was stunned. They had 6 faces from the West Bank who were victims of closure or home demolition or land confiscation or abuse by Israeli settlers. Those human stories have to be told. So I think that adopting cases, being able to elevate those cases and personalize those cases is ultimately the best way to do work on the local level. Because when the conflict becomes defined as Israeli people versus Palestinian people, we'll win that debate, or at least we'll have a real debate. But if it's Israeli people versus a problem, we're going to lose it. So I would suggest elevating Palestinian voices, telling their stories, get their faces out there, and win people over. Go to congressmen and say, I need you to help with this person who's losing their house. Or, I mean, that's where Betty McCollum's bill is so important. It tells real stories of real kids and real people. And the extent to which we tell that story, we win.
If I could just add one thing to that, I think that is really important about the stories, the Palestinian voices themselves. For those of us who are not Palestinians especially, or not Israelis, I think the other thing that's so important is to talk about rights. Keep the focus on human rights, not on how many states there are. You know, I have my own opinions about states, and I think many of us are now looking, whatever we think about it, the possibility of a 2-state solution is simply no longer possible. There's no land left. So, but you don't have to get into that discussion. It's one of the problems in Congress that right now, one of the excuses we hear sometimes for not supporting this or that sign-on letter or whatever it is, well, it doesn't call for a 2-state solution, and so we can't sign on to it. It's not our call. For those of, you know, I'm a Jewish girl from California. There's no reason in the world I should have any say in how many states there are 7,000 miles away. My family's not there. I don't have, you know, I don't have any connection to that territory. I don't live there. My family doesn't live there. My family never lived there. So if we start with the question of rights and equality, it brings it back to what people are familiar with. You know, is this like racism in the US? Well, yeah, in certain ways it is, in this way, this way, and this way. In this way, it's different, but racism is still racism. We're fighting a battle for equality, just like people here fought for equality, just like people in so many other places have fought for equality, for equal rights. It makes it a lot less complicated, right? Israelis have human rights too, right? This isn't only about Palestinians. The Palestinians are the ones whose rights are being denied right now by a government there and by our government here. So that's what we're talking about. But we're really asking for everybody to be treated the same. We're not the ones who are treating Israel differently, that we're holding Israel to a different standard. The problem is that Israel's supporters are holding it to a different standard, which is to say a much lower standard than anything else. So we should be proud of the notion of saying, we want to treat Israel the way we treat every other country. There's problems in all those ways, but if it was treated the same as every other country, we'd be well on our way towards equal rights.
That's right. And I can add a few words if we still have some time, Adam. Like I want to say, like what I really like what Jim and Phyllis said about centering Palestinian voices, because it's very important for us to hear what Palestinians are saying in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, in 48, in Gaza. That on the one hand gives a clear direction for what the Palestinian civil society is asking for. On the other hand, it's a good way to deal with like historic problems that we have in our country with like objectifying or like creating like rescue projects, out of people outside of the U.S. Because Palestinians don't need to be saved by us, like they don't need like a savior, but they do need our solidarity. They need our support, and I say they here as a Palestinian American myself, Palestinian in the diaspora, speaking about Palestinians in historic Palestine. There is definitely a very strong movement for equal rights in Palestine. And as Phyllis was saying, whether it ends up in one state or 5 states or a confederation, I think thinking about a future where everyone is equal is a much more straightforward way to handle the situation. So regardless of what's the actual like recipe and what's gonna like be the outcome, whether it's 1 or 5 states, whether it's a confederation or different states, whether it's one state where everyone is equal, I think the end goal here is that everyone should be treated equally. And for us in the US, that means something. Like I think for us in the US, it means something to see that Israel as a state now discriminates against its own citizens. Like the 20% Palestinian citizens of Israel are treated as second-class citizens. The other millions of Palestinians in occupied territories in East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, they're treated as second-class humans, not even citizens. But like thinking about like the equality, equal rights, equal access to resources, like these are extremely important concepts to take into account. And like as I started my remarks with talking about our responsibility, so we're not only engaging in Israel-Palestine as an act of charity. We're not being like, let's go like find some like cause out there and help some poor people, which is not bad by itself. But I'm saying in the case of Israel-Palestine, recognizing that we are funding this, that we're subsidizing crimes, that we're a part of the problem, and we have a moral responsibility to step in to expose what our government is doing, to say to our own government that they have to stop doing this. I think that is like a different kind of approach than just talking about Israel-Palestine as a quote-unquote conflict that's going out there. Like it's a different mindset to think about it as something that we're funding, we're contributing to in our tax dollars. And the last point that I want to also reiterate is usually the counter talking points, and Jim and Phyllis are very familiar with this. Whenever you say hold Israel accountable, get voices that jump at you to say you're picking on Israel, or you're doing this because you're anti-Semitic, or because what about Assad? What about Saddam? What about like that's usually the counter example. And like in 2021, it is becoming much easier to answer this, because our answers to these counterpoints is we're only trying to hold Israel to the same standard we're holding everyone else, and we're condemning all other criminals, whether it is Netanyahu or Assad or Saddam or MBS, we're gonna condemn them, like we're not picking our favorite dictator here, It is about holding all dictators, all abusive governments, whether it's Sisi or whether it is the Israeli government headed by whomever. It's about holding them to the same standards. We have laws in the US on the books that prohibit us from funding and aiding abusive governments, from selling them or gifting them weapons. So, I mean, I think bringing it back to this universal standard that we're trying to uphold, talking about existing US law, or legislation that is being introduced, like the one that Jim mentioned earlier by Betty McCollum, 2590 or others. Like I think like the debate now is actually much different than 15 years ago when I came to Washington D.C. When I came in 2005, it was extremely difficult to say the P word, to say Palestine, to mention Israel. Now it's there is a space. Like back in the day, we used to have 4 or 5 members of Congress who are willing to stick their necks out to say, maybe I'm not going to vote yes on this bill, and they get hammered. And now we have 60 and 70 members of Congress willing to sign on congressional letters challenging narratives about Israel and Palestine. So it's definitely a different political moment. People use the word, the word apartheid. A few years ago, if you use the word apartheid, you would be like committing some sort of a crime, but now the word apartheid in describing Israel has become mainstream in 2021. And I think that is in part because of reports by big organizations, because of the shift of public opinion. So it is a different moment. And like for those who have been working on Israel-Palestine for a while, I think they recognize this and they recognize the opportunities. For the newcomers, I want to add one last suggestion to them. Read Phyllis and Jim's books. Very good background information over what happened in the last few decades. I think sign up for our organizations. We send updates about everything that happens every week. There is a new $735 million weapon deal that was just approved a few weeks ago. There is a new $1 billion request that is being shot through Congress. $1 more billion on top of the $3.8 billion that Israel wants to request from our tax dollars that we're trying to oppose. So there's a lot that happens. We can translate many of these concepts that we discussed on the call into daily actions. So I do want to recommend that everyone signs up to our action alerts, our updates on our websites. That would be a good way to stay in touch.
Yes, and we will include links to your site and then links to the books as well, with follow-up and be sure that people have these tools at their disposal, right? So it's just about, what is it, 8:12. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. There are a few nice questions here that I would love to be able to get to, but I'm afraid that unless anybody's really dying to answer these questions, and I'm seeing some head shakes, no. So thank you for your submissions. We really appreciate everybody being here. And to Jim, to Phyllis, to Raed, we're so thankful. We're so thankful for your expertise, for your years and years of hard work. And we want to be able to do as an organization, as individuals, and everybody who cares and is passionate enough to be here, to be able to bring this education forward into our work. And just to thank you again. Everybody can be sure to go buy those books. Be sure to go follow Don Mina. They do great work, and we're super appreciative. So with that, I'm going to sign off and say a big thank you from New Jersey Peace Action. And,
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Peace Action.
Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.